So axis labels and axis marking are probably the most important feature of a figure, because if you cannot read your x-axis labels and you cannot read your y-axis labels, then all you have is a pretty picture without any context at all. So as you can see in this figure on the right that we're working on, these axis labels are really small and hard to read. So they're barely legible at this large size. And ideally what we want is we want font sizes that are much larger and bolder and easier to read. And so what that'll enable us to do is that if we wanted to shrink the size of this graph down and maybe fit two of them side by side in an 8.5 by 11 paper, even if you shrink this down by 50%, these axis labels can still be read. Whereas if we were to try and use this one and we shrunk the size of this figure down by half, there's no way we would be able to read these x-axis and these y-axis labels. So let's work on changing that to make it larger, like we have on the graph on the left. So to do that, again, I still have my sidebar with properties and options. So if I left click on the horizontal axis, you'll notice that not only is the chart itself selected, but the axis down here is also selected. And so we've got various options here. But the first option that we actually want to look at isn't on the sidebar. What we want to do is actually change the font and the font size. So for that, we can just come up here to the Home toolbar. And by default, Microsoft likes to use this Calibri font, which should be okay. However, most professional publications kind of standardize with Times New Roman. So, you can scroll down the font list. It's sorted alphabetically, and you can go down to T, where you should find Times New Roman, and select a font size of 16 and make it bold. All right, so I probably wouldn't go smaller than 16. You could maybe go up a little bit larger to maybe 18 if you wanted to. But for this example, I've got a font size of 16. Now we can do the same thing here with the vertical axis or the y-axis. So just click on it like that, and you'll see now the axis is selected, and change the font to Times New Roman, make it 16 point and bold. Okay, so now we've got font sizes that are close to what we've got here on the left. But do you notice something that's a little off? So notice this graph here on the left, this figure on the left. The text is a very strong, bold black color. Whereas over here, it's actually dark gray. So that's a weird thing that Microsoft does. So what we want to do is also, in addition to selecting the font, the size, and that it's bold, click here, and you can see it's not black, it's dark gray. Make it black. Okay, let's come over here and change this one to also be black. Okay, so that looks good. So that kind of takes care of the font size and making it bold, making it legible. But what we also need is we need these little tick marks down below. So how do we adjust that? So again, I've got this axis selected. You can see I've got a selection box here around it with these blue control points at the corners. And if I come over here to the fill and line option, this little paint bucket, and click on that, I can make it so that it's a solid line. And let's make it black. Okay, it's black. And we'll make it 2-point, which is going to be the same width as the plot area that we set earlier. Now you'll notice that we're not actually getting any tick marks down here. That's okay. So I think if we come back over here to axis options, let's see here, is it there? Yes, and you scroll down, you can see we've got tick marks. So expand that. And so the major type tick marks, we want to put on the outside. So if you click outside, it puts the tick marks on the outside of the plot area. If we put inside, it puts it on the inside. If you put cross, it crosses both inside and outside. The preferred method is to use outside, because that way, if you have any data points that are close to the edge of your graph, then the tick mark isn't actually intersecting any of your plotted points. So it's just safer to put them on the outside. Now you'll notice that we've got these little minor tick marks here. So to turn those on, we can just go under tick marks, minor type, and change that to outside also. You have to be careful. Sometimes these minor type tick marks make things a little more confusing to read. Here, it's not so bad. It's easy to determine that this is the 100 tick mark, and that's the 200 tick mark, and so on. The other thing to notice about tick marks is you want to have tick marks that are maybe at a scale that's easy to understand. So because we've got 4 tick marks here, we could read this as 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180, 200. So these marks are by 20s. We can change that if we scroll back up, and right here under units, the major units are by 100. So we've got 0, 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. But the minor units we could change to maybe 25. And watch the number of marks change down here from 4 down to 3. So now everything is being done in increments of 25. So 0, 25, 50, 75, 100. And this arguably might be actually a little bit easier to read than this one. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave this in increments of 25. So now we can do the same thing here with this left axis. So again, if I stay here and I scroll down, I can put the major tick marks on the outside. And notice you can barely see them, but it added tick marks, but they're barely, they're hard to read, but we can change that. We can turn minor tick marks on also, but you see how this vertical axis is shorter? And so by adding those tick marks in there, it's actually going to make it look crowded. So I'm going to go ahead and put none for those. But how do we get it so that it's easier to read those tick marks? That's where we come back to the fill and line options. And the reason why it's so hard to read is because, first of all, the color is not black, it's gray. So we can change it to black. Okay, so that made those tick marks darker, but they're not white enough. So let's increase the width to 2. Now they're easy to read. You can experiment here if we wanted to try have a minor tick mark. Let's come back over and turn the minor type tick marks back on to outside, but there's just so many of them that's hard to read. But notice here that this is in increments of 50. So what if we changed the minor type to be increments of 25? Now that's easier to read. That looks okay. So we could do something like this if we wanted to. I'll go ahead and leave it on. just so that you can see that's another way that we could do the vertical axis versus not having minor tick marks here on the left.